You ready? We're about to start.
Oh, I'm ready.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everyone. My name's Christine Henning, and I'm a senior in the College of Management. Our sponsor for this afternoon's Impact session is the College of Management and the Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, and our webcasting partner is Impact Media Solutions. Our guest today is Professor David Herold, Professor Emeritus of Organizational Behavior and former holder of the Jones Chair at the College of Management. He is the co-author of the recently released book, Change the Way You Lead Change, and after his presentation today, he will be available for a book signing event outside in the atrium. Dr. Herold received his PhD from Yale University and joined Georgia Tech in 1973. In his more than 30 years of teaching at Georgia Tech, Dr. Herold was voted Professor of the Year multiple times and built an impressive list of publications. Dr. Herold serves as a reviewer and editorial consultant for book publishers, journals, the National Science Foundation, and the National Institute for Mental Health. He is active as a management consultant, helping companies address a wide range of organizational and human resources issues. Please join me in giving a warm welcome back to Professor David Herold.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Christine. Can you hear me? Everybody good in the back? Great. Well, certainly good to be back on my old stomping grounds, courtesy of Terry. Thank you. How many people here are undergraduate management students? Okay, graduate management students? Graduate other students? People in business? Okay, I'd just like to get a little bit of a lay of the land and try to figure out who the audience is. I want to talk about a subject matter that's near and dear to everybody's heart, being that for 34 years I taught what was commonly referred to as one of the soft subjects. Always riled me when people said it was the soft stuff. I said, how come people get fired for not knowing the soft stuff? And the hard stuff is fairly easy to learn in comparison. And with all the turmoil on Wall Street, we always used to say, how do we attract students to organizational behavior? They all want to be financial analysts. They all want to go to Wall Street. They all want to work in investment banking. Well, let me tell you guys, the world has changed. There are no investment banks anymore. So if that was your goal in life, you're going to go through a career change. So I think the topic of change is so apropos now with everything we see and watch around us. I want to give you a little bit of background as to how I wound up here, what the journey was. I guess I was reasonably well trained and applied what I'd learned to some of the things that I saw in organizations and did a reasonable amount of consulting for organizations. And the issue of change often came up. And can you help us do this? Can you help us do this? Can you help us do this? And about 13 years ago, I got really frustrated because I did everything I was taught how to do, and many of the changes still blew up in my face and in my clients' faces. And it's not fun when you're getting paid a lot of money to supposedly know, to watch things go south. And I would scratch my head and say, what's going on here? And that really started about a 13-year search, which then started building up into research, building up into trying to really delve in, interviewing hundreds, if not thousands of managers about projects, and basically saying, okay, what went right, what went wrong, why, and how can we fit that in a framework that'll be more helpful to the practicing manager in terms of when confronting change, here are some things you want to think about, and here are some things you want to do. So basically, that's kind of the journey, and that's where I come from. And in doing that, obviously some of the stuff that me and my colleague Don Fedor did, wrote, and said was considered heresy. We had to go against the gurus and the biggies in the field who said, follow our model, this is the way to do it. And we would say, yeah, a lot of people have followed your model, it didn't work. And so there's a certain amount of friction in trying to take a more holistic, more realistic view of the world when everybody's out there wanting a simplistic, hey, give me the quick answer and move on your way, that's all I want. I always compare it to dieting, where Americans are just infatuated with give me the quick diet. You know, tell me how many of these grapefruits I need to eat for how many days in a row and how many pounds I'm going to lose, and I'll be okay. And as those of you that have struggled with weight issues, and I certainly am one of them, there is no easy answer. And even when you think you have the answer, it is tough as hell to implement. So change is sort of like that. There are no easy answers. That's one of the things we learned. It is very difficult to do and do well. But what I now tell executives all the time is think of it as a batting average. If you think you're going to bat 1,000, you're nuts. Okay? When does a baseball player go to the Hall of Fame? What kind of batting average? Lifetime. Anybody? 300? You know, 400 is guaranteed. But 300 lifetime, you pretty much get in. And I say, how many companies today would tolerate an employee that gets it right 3 out of 10 times? Right? That's not a very good track record. So why do these people go to the Hall of Fame? Anybody? Other stuff? What other stuff? Why do those people get enshrined and others do not? They're better than everybody else, even with that 300 average, right? It's an extremely difficult thing to do, and if you can do it at that rate, you're doing very, very, very well. So change management, for those of you that are just starting out in your careers and going out, you're going to get hit by so many changes and so many managers who are trying to drive change in your part of the organization. Keep thinking of a batting average. It is so difficult that if we can bat 300, 400, we're doing very, very well. The question is, why are so many of our companies batting 100 or 125? And what can we do to improve their batting average? And that's all I'm trying to do, and what I'm going to do today is walk you through some of the things that we've learned, which are, of course, reflected in the book that we just published, but it was just a way of trying to say this stuff has to get out from the academic journals, which are very fancy but read by no one, and get them out to a practicing audience where hopefully it'll do some good. Okay? In case you doubt that change is everywhere, it is everywhere. The political parties have done their best to hijack my topic, and I resist them. Unfortunately, I don't get 120,000 people in Berlin adoring me. I've got to settle for 200 Georgia Tech people. But by and large, we're dealing with an issue that is first and foremost on everybody's mind in every aspect of life. Okay? And that is true of any business organization today. Unfortunately, you would think that if it's all around us, we'd get pretty good at managing it, because human beings are pretty adaptable. And usually if you throw us the same issue time after time after time, we figure out how to handle it. Well, in this case, that is not true. Business Week did a survey of boards of directors and asked them, what is the most common reason why you ask CEOs to resign? The #1 reason, they mishandle change. Mentioned 31% of the firings, more so than any other reason. IBM did a survey of executives, obviously trying to see what market there will be for their consulting and other products. 80% said, my organization is going to go through some radical changes in the next 2 years. Unfortunately, we don't know how to do it. It doesn't go very well. We haven't had great success. But it's not going to stop us from doing it again. It's just that we know it's not going to work out very well. Billions of dollars, literally billions, cost of failed change. Some of you who remember some of the mergers that went south, Time Warner, AOL being a classic example, destroyed wealth to the tune of billions of dollars on what seemed like a good idea at the time. Hey, let's go do it. People don't like to count the human cost. Typically, the accountants tell us that's an intangible cost, and therefore we can't tally it. But if you've had a friend, family member, or someone who was under stress from rapid, frequent change in their organization, who maybe thought of quitting, who maybe lost their job due to significant changes, you know that there's a human cost. It's just that we as a society have really not tallied it. And we write thousands of books, articles, hire consultants, train consultants, all in this area of change management. If you got nothing to do, go on Amazon.com and just punch in change leadership or managing change. And last time I looked, you come up with like 237,000 documents. So it's not that we lack people pontificating about it. Well, some of the big gurus in the business, John Kotter, who just retired from Harvard, having been one of the top gurus, decided we needed just one more book on change. And he just published it this month. And the first thing he says is, you know what? Most organizational changes fail. And you sit there and say, well, wait a second. You and your cohort have been helping organizations for 40 years to do this. How come they're still failing? How come we're not better at it? So that is kind of the history, and that's kind of where I come from. So now we sit down and say, well, okay, why might that be? Why are companies so bad at implementing change in their setting or in their organization? Well, one obvious reason, and that's back to the batting average question, it's tough. You know, organizations are complex organisms composed of many moving parts, and here you're coming in, you know, with a screwdriver and a flywheel that's rotating at a certain speed and trying to stick that screwdriver into one particular tooth, and what's going to happen? You know, you're going to get some kind of fight, some kind of pushback, some kind of breaking of the screwdriver or breaking of the little teeth on the flywheel. It's not an easy thing to do. Organizations are so complex. So that's possibly one of the explanations. The other explanation that I subscribe to much more strongly is that our approach has been all wrong. And why do I say that? Most things you will read about change, those 237,000 some odd documents, make one assumption, that what we're trying to change or implement in organizations is good, makes sense, has been well thought out, and all that's left for us to do is to smoothly implement it. And the more I'm in this business, the more I find that that's a lousy assumption. Okay? And if you start seeing the recommendations that flow once you make that assumption, most of us are somewhat familiar, and those of you that are in business or fooled around with this have certainly been exposed to them. Well, you got to create a sense of urgency. You know, people don't want to embrace a change if they're not really motivated, and you don't let them know why this is important. Well, you know, you also should collaborate, build guiding coalitions, because certainly teams of people across an organization working together are more likely to make the change happen than one individual alone. Communicate, 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 that's the major mantra. If we put out newsletters, if we put out every kind of web-based communication, if we drum it into people's heads 8 times a day, they'll finally get it and they'll do it. Involve, participate, bring people on board, make them part of the solution, and then they'll embrace it because they'll feel empowered and they'll go ahead and do it. All very nice, commonsensical solutions, but notice they assume that what you're trying to implement is sound. Well, what if we did all the right things in the service of a really dumb idea? Okay? As I heard people talk about on TV lately, wouldn't that be like putting lipstick on a pig and seeing that something good should come out of it? And we have a lot of people talking about the importance of rewarding people for making change, celebrating small wins, having celebratory events at milestone on the way to the final change as a way of getting people on board. So most approaches that you will come into from a consulting point of view, HR point of view, article point of view, book point of view, focus on what we call the change process, how to try to implement. None of them that we could find help managers say, and how do I decide what I want to change? How do I decide when I want to do it? How do I decide how much of it I want to do? And that is really where we started doing our work. Okay, feel free to interrupt me, but I'm going to talk fairly quickly, hopefully for about 30 minutes, and leave plenty of time for Q&A. But if something bothers you, if something is not clear, by all means, just raise your hand. We'll try to deal with it right then and there. Okay, why did we find changes fail? Well, number one, we found because some of the changes were dumb ideas. Frankly, some of the changes that executives asked me to help them implement, I thought were very dumb ideas. And you try to tell an executive that, and they usually don't take that very well. So you wind up getting fired, and then somebody else comes in who's willing to do what they're asking him to do, and so you kind of had this ethical dilemma. Well, I tried several times to get fired from consulting jobs, and I wasn't very successful, and I tried one time to have a major confrontation with a senior VP where I collected data from all his direct reports, each of whom agreed that this is not going to work. And I asked them why, and they said, well, our people aren't ready. The software hasn't been debugged. People don't know what roles they're going to play. We haven't yet sufficiently trained them. And I said, cool, I got them where I want them. So we went on a retreat, and I surfaced all this data where I said to this vice president, look, this is what your people are saying. And I said, surely he's not going to go through with it. Well, his answer to me was, David, I hear you. And he said it to them because they were in the room. He said, I agree with you, but I promised my boss we would get this done in 90 days, so we're launching it on Monday. You know, so this is what you run into in the real world, is that there is a rush sometimes to implement half-baked ideas for a variety of reasons. Career issues, commitments we've made to our superiors, and things of that sort. Some changes just don't address the underlying problem. As organizations have economic difficulties, reorganizations and layoffs are the magical changes. Well, we do a lot of research. The only thing that a layoff predicts about an organization is that it'll have future layoffs. It does not predict future health. It does not predict future economic well-being. Organizations and reorganizations, a dime a dozen. Look at every company. Well, today we're going to centralize. Next year we're going to decentralize. The following year we're going to centralize again. Why? Because the underlying business issues are not going away, and we are treating things that we think will solve our problem, but they really don't. This is very common. Leadership is just not up to the task of change. If change is tough, it requires heavy, heavy, heavy duty lifting on the part of management up and down the levels. They've got to support it. They've got to work with it. They've got to remove obstacles when they are found. They've got to make some tough decisions about what things can be allowed to fall by the wayside in order for the change that they're interested in to really receive full attention. Well, I rarely find leaders that deeply involved in their own changes. It's kind of they dream them up someplace in the shower, then they hand them off to somebody, and then they're on to something else. They've lost interest. Another issue, another strategic issue, another problem they're trying to deal with, and the change is kind of left to flounder. And then we kind of turn around a year later and say, well, why didn't this go better? And it turns out the change was an orphan. Nobody really was out there championing that particular cause. We find that some changes fail because organizational members are just not up to the task. They're either not, they don't have the skills, they don't have the motivation, they're so overburdened by day-to-day events that they don't even have any slack time to think about the change or adapt to it. In the book, we label that turbulence, and I compare it to teaching someone to kayak in a nice placid lake and then saying, okay, you got it. Now let's take you to a stage 4 rapid and throw you in. Same boat, same paddle, same paddler, but crashing against the rocks because they can't master a rapid. Well, we can talk about change in the abstract, but when you're in an organization trying to implement it, how many other changes are going on? How serious are they? How much time do they consume? How much energy do they consume? How much energy is left to that individual to devote to the change that we're hoping they're devoting 100% of their time to? Well, what about the rest of the world? They're not let off the hook. Organizational systems, processes, structures get in the way of changes all the time. I don't know how many of you followed Dell Computers, but a couple of years ago they had a disastrous downturn in their tech support reputation. People were really upset with them, and they were actually losing market share. And the question was, how do you improve tech support? Well, the first answer, obviously, is you make some changes. Buy bigger whips, work them harder, work them longer, threaten them. They got a new vice president in charge of tech support, and he asked a very simple question. How do you folks get paid? And it turned out that they got paid by the number of calls they handled. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that it pays off to be rude to the customer that calls in, because they'll hang up on you, or you hang up on them, and then they'll simply call back again, and then some other tech support person gets credit for the call, and you can handle a lot of calls a day this way. So, you know, aha experience. He says, wait a second, why don't we pay people based on resolving calls? And all of a sudden, Dell's customer satisfaction score started to take off because people were calling tech support and were actually getting help. Why were they getting help? Because the person was interested in helping them, because they didn't get bonused until the measurement system showed that they were in fact solving customers' problems. So that would be an example of some organizations have something wrong systemically that needs to be tweaked in order for it to be more accommodating of a change you're trying to make. And then finally, external conditions very often get in the way. And again, the events of the last 2 weeks are a great example. You may have a terrific change in mind. It may involve acquiring one of your suppliers because the strategic need to do that is so obvious. You can integrate them into your plans, and you can be vertically integrated, and you're assured a source of supplies. Only one little hitch: when you go to the bank and you say, I need $2 million to buy this supplier, what's the bank going to say today? Sorry, we got no credit. So some of the best changes and some of the best change ideas can get derailed for a whole bunch of reasons. And our research has basically discovered, exposed, whatever you want to call it, all these various reasons. And that's when we had our epiphany, saying, there's a lot of ways that changes can go bad, and not communicating or not creating a sense of urgency is but one of them. I'm not saying it's not an important one, but it's just one of a myriad of possible explanations. So basically, why do we get change poor outcomes? Sometimes we got the wrong change, sometimes we got the wrong leadership, sometimes the people are inadequate, sometimes the internal context is wrong, sometimes the external context conspires against us, and yes, sometimes we screw up the process. So what I've done here in a few minutes is try to put everything that's out there in context of saying, when you read something or when you read an article about change, I want you to plot it and say, well, what are they talking about? And what we're arguing is that a vast majority are talking only about this. I want you, as you go out on your careers, to become more savvy about also asking these questions. Everybody with me so far? Are we okay? Back? All right, so let's move on. Sure, please.
So if the problem is outside forces, what could you as a change agent do about something that's currently outside?
Great. Would you hold that for me for 3 minutes? Because that's the whole purpose. Yeah, when you conclude that, you're going to have to make a decision. Is it so overwhelming that I will not succeed, or is it that I can adjust for it? Make sense? Let me give you an example that I used today with another group. Let's say, for example, that you want to introduce telecommuting into your organization. You have every right to expect at $5 a gallon that people are going to be more enthusiastic about that change than maybe they were at $1 a gallon, right? So this is an external condition that facilitates your change. You say, hey, I'm going to have an easier time with this, even if I don't do such a good job communicating about it, even if I don't do such a great job explaining it. Well, you can also go to reverse. What if one of those things was such that it would be a hindrance? Okay? Then you have to say, can I overcome that hindrance? How do I do that? Can I communicate why it's still important? Can I bribe people to do it? Can I provide certain incentives that'll make them still want to do it? Or, Alan, at some point, it's going to knock me out of the ball game, and I am just as well off not even trying it because it ain't going to work. And that's really the strategic thinking that we're encouraging. Most management students think of strategic thinking as matching the organization up against the external environment in general. I'm saying change strategizing is matching your change up against everything, including the internal and the external environment. Is that all right? Does that help? Okay, great. So, most of you that'll go into organizations, or those of you that are in organizations, and I know there's some people in the class from HP, and I know HP, or at least I used to know HP relatively well. The way it works in most organizations, some senior level executive looks out at the horizon and says, I've got a business imperative that I need to address, something's going on. Typically, I need to decide what to change. Now again, we can kind of sarcastically say that takes place in the shower or in some other such room, but the individual or individuals make a decision that something needs to be changed in order to meet this business condition. They then decide, okay, how am I going to proceed? And you can go a bunch of ways. You can say, well, we'll proceed by turning it over to our HR department and say, ball's in your court, go make it happen. We might proceed by hiring a high-priced consultant. We might proceed by doing a pilot test of this idea in one department, might be a new technology implementation or something like that, to see how it works. And if we like it, we're going to roll it out in the whole organization. So there's a variety of decisions that need to be made about how to proceed. And then once we make those decisions, we implement. This could also bring in vendors, and the vendors might do some of the training. All these logistical steps take place in that sequence of events. Well, the executive role diminishes, and I use the term executive, senior management interchangeably, whoever has the prerogative to dream up these changes. Their role diminishes as the process goes on, and the question becomes, well, whose role increases and who does a better job of watching the shop and making it happen? Well, the answer sometimes is nobody. Okay? The answer sometimes, mid-level people, who I call change facilitators as a broad term. Again, these could be internal consultants, these could be HR people, these could be external consultants. But the main thing this diagram tries to point out, they were not at the table dreaming up the change. They simply are brought in to say, hey, make it happen. Which brings me back to the original assumption, well, what if what you're asking me to make happen really was not a good idea to begin with? So we have here a disconnect between executives who should let go as the change rolls out, but there's a lack of somebody else picking up the slack in trying to really worry about it, nurture it, implement it, work with it. And these people very often wind up being functionaries. They do little things like develop the communication campaign or decide whether we should have a town hall meeting or whether a newsletter is going to be sufficient. But it's not really hands-on, heavy lifting, deciding what is best for the organization. So what we've done is take this typical flow of events. Here it is again. And this will now go back to Alan Flory's question. We said, okay, let's assume that I can get you to stop on day one and think this thing through. What would I want you to be thinking about? Well, the first thing I want you to do is own up to the fact that most of us wear colored glasses of various types, and that the 11th commandment is not, thou shalt reorganize. Okay? That in fact, executives, managers, leaders have options. Sometimes they wear blinders and don't see the options, but then their job is to seek counsel, to work with other people, seek inputs, maybe benchmark against other organizations that have had the same kind of difficulty, maybe share it with trusted other people in the organization, and say, what do you think we ought to do? And this is a very difficult step. I don't minimize it one bit. Getting senior level leadership to understand that what they think is strategically appropriate to respond to the business environment is the only way to respond. And getting them to sit still and say, well, maybe there's a different way of skinning that cat. Next question, who shall lead? Okay, a lot was done in Atlanta, for those of you that have been reading newspapers in the last couple of years, about Bob Nardelli's leadership of Home Depot. Now, if you look at it from a strategic point of view, he was more right than wrong. Systems needed to be tightened up, he was right. Needed better IT, he was right. Needed to centralize some of the buying so that we get more efficiencies into the system, he was right. Needed to make people a little more accountable and not just loosey-goosey entrepreneurial at the store level, he was probably right. One might run a problem. He wasn't able to lead that change, had no personal credibility, did not have the trust of the employees, came from an industry that was seen as totally foreign to retail, showed that he didn't understand retail very well when he first entered Home Depot, attacked a culture that was very strong and proud in saying, boy, we are good and look at this great thing we built, and he comes in and says, no, you guys don't know anything about retailing, I'll show you how to do it. Classic example of very good change ideas getting totally torpedoed because the leader did not think through, what's my role? How much credibility do I have with these people? If I don't, who does? Can I enlist them in my army? Can I get them to go out and try to sell these changes? How do I overcome some of these concerns that people have? How can I show them that I do have a better way? He didn't spend much time worrying about those issues. And in fact, is no longer CEO at Home Depot, in part because these changes went so poorly. Okay, and you will see, without beating up on any one individual, you will see that that same analysis keeps coming in, and you can add additional components. Who's expected to follow? Let's play with a Home Depot example again. If I'm expecting people to adopt the change who are very proud, who have much of themselves invested in the company, who have stock ownership, up to the hilt, who built this thing in 1979 to the current time with their own blood, sweat, and tears, that's a little different than leading a bunch of people who see themselves as, it's just a job. I show up, I get paid, I go home. What do I care? If they want me to do this, I'll do that. No. These people were married to the company. Remember, they were bleeding orange is what we were told. Well, you can't go up to somebody who's bleeding orange and say, orange is no good. Blue is better. Those people are going to fight you tooth and nail. So again, as you do the situational analysis, you say, well, what kinds of people am I asking to adopt this new great idea, and how do I factor that into my thinking? So obviously, one quick solution, you better go slower, because you're going to have to get these people to kind of slowly get over to your side, because you can't just overnight tell them everything you've done for 16, 17, whatever many years is lousy, and what I'm going to ask you to do is better. Under what internal conditions? If a company is really in trouble, things are not going well, it's not that hard to convince people that change is necessary. But when things are going really well, and they think they're doing very well, it's very hard to say, hey, there's a sense of urgency, you better change your ways. So we have to look inside. We can't just take a book solution and apply it to our setting and say, what's going on inside the company? One of the things that was going on at Home Depot is that they were famous for their decentralized organizational structure. And that had a lot going for it. It was autonomy. Store managers and district managers were proud of what they were doing. They ran their own little business, and those weren't such small businesses. They were $20, $30 million businesses. They could deal with local vendors. They could make decisions even on some products that they will carry in the store. So if you're in a rural area and you want to carry horse feed, you could carry horse feed. But if you were, at Perimeter Mall, you probably wouldn't carry too much horse feed. So centralized planning was seen as a no-no, and the decentralization was seen as having a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial benefit to the company, having helped build it. Well, you can't jump into that setting and say, you know what? Yeah, that was a mistake. Everything should be centralized at corporate headquarters. And again, that was the beginning of the end. People lost autonomy, they lost enthusiasm, they lost their excitement for the job, they started turning over, they started getting replaced by other soldiers who were more willing to fight that fight. And when you and I went into the store, we didn't get the customer service, we didn't find the products we wanted on the shelf, and we started going to Lowe's. And Lowe's had a major resurgence under this difficult period for Home Depot. And by the way, I don't mean to just dump on Home Depot. I just thought it was an Atlanta example. Most of us are familiar with it. I'm a stockholder. I wish them well. I really would like to see them turn this mess around. Under what external conditions, and that goes back to the question we had earlier, the final stage of my analysis is what else is going on. Let me give you a simple example. You're making a change that is going to consolidate and take power away from a programming group. Well, what's the labor market for good programmers? If the labor market stinks and losing one is very difficult to replace, you better think twice, because if the change has an impact on the retention of programmers and you cannot find replacements in the labor market, then your victory may be a hollow victory, as the benefits of the change are set against the disadvantage of having to replace valuable people. On the other hand, if the labor market stinks and they're a dime a dozen and you can replace them tomorrow, go ahead, who cares? You know, the external conditions, labor market, whatever, are favoring your change. And yeah, if there's some people that get ticked off, not a problem. Let's do it. This is what we have added to what's out there in change leadership, change management. The notion that instead of the tried and true, top down, I'm the boss, I've got the right to make these decisions, and I'll make them whether I'm knowledgeable or not, that we can encourage people to hopefully go through this more holistic approach that says, what all do I need to put into my little calculus, and what all do I need to consider? And now we're going to be back to Alan Fleury's final point, which is, okay, if I've done all that, what are the options? What might come out of this discussion? Well, one thing that may come out of it is I'm a pretty smart cookie. I figured it all out. I was right on target. And after I went through this whole situational diagnosis, I'm still convinced that what we're trying to do is the right thing to do. Let's roll it out Monday. Cool, go do it. Another possibility is, you know, it sounded like a good idea on the back of the napkin, but now that I've really mulled it over, there's some serious issues that I want to reconsider. Maybe we ought to go slower. Maybe we ought to modify the scope. Maybe we ought to try it in one plant before we roll it out company-wide, because there's some things here that bother me here, 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 here. Maybe we ought to take our best project manager and make her the lead, but she only has credibility in that one plant, so let her take the lead in that plant, and then if the change goes really well, we'll go to the other plant managers and say, hey, look what we just did at plant X, wouldn't you like to have some help in doing it in your plant? So all these kind of contingencies come out from my analysis of what I think the change deserves and needs. And then finally, and this is the Dell example, you know, the change still makes sense. Yes, I want to improve customer service. Yes, I want to improve tech support. But you know what? I don't think I can do it until I change some conditions on the ground. In this case, it was changing the compensation system. So we call these collateral changes. Sometimes the best thing an executive can do is go out and find what collateral changes need to be made in order to make things easier for the change. Another example, most of you are too young to remember, but when Bell South was going through its tumultuous times with deregulation of telecommunication, there was a big stink in Atlanta, and the Atlanta Journal and Constitution would fan it, that what a terrible thing to do. They're laying people off, and at the same time, they're on the street hiring new people. That is so terribly unfair, because if they need people, why didn't they just keep the ones they had? And Bell South had a very interesting strategic take on this. They said, yeah, we got bodies in place, but they have what they call regulated mentalities. They said, we want people that have not grown up under a regulated utility mentality, people that are entrepreneurial, people that have sold products, people that have had to worry about marketing. We want people from Procter & Gamble, even if they know nothing about telecommunications. So there was kind of a method to their madness where they said, we first need to make collateral changes, okay, where we need to alter our mix of employees and their backgrounds and their orientations before we can proceed with many of the deregulation changes. So there are anecdotes and examples out there, and what we try to do, and obviously, you know, we hope that you will read the book, because I can't do it all in 30 minutes, but the point being, it's a more complex way of thinking of the world. It's a guide for what stages your thinking ought to go through. And then when you get to the end of that process, Alan, you may decide, I can't overcome these external conditions, in which case, don't waste your time and money on a change. Or I can, but I need to account for them. More time, more effort, more communication, different kinds of people, who knows? And I close with a quote that comes out of a Harvard Business Review article. And these are just feedback loops that talk about the model. Take your strategy into account. Decide, given what I now know about what to change, who to change, and under what conditions, how do I want to change it? This is where all the process stuff I riled against early on in the presentation, that's where it comes in. It comes in at the tail end. Don't put the carriage before the horse. Now is the time to talk about how, but also how fast. As we said, reconsider what you want to change, maybe, or make those collateral changes. The final metaphor that is used by Janie Duck is kind of the one that I like. She uses the metaphor of a hanging mobile. And if you've ever tinkered with a mobile, right, if you take one piece off, the whole thing goes cockeyed. It's a delicate balance. And what we're arguing is that our framework for thinking about change is, in fact, a delicate balance. If any one of those pieces is out of whack because you fail to consider it, you probably have a cockeyed mobile or you have a cockeyed change. So that's what we're preaching. That's what we're pushing. Students coming out of school, perfect audience, because you are going to run into this on your first job and every job thereafter. Somebody's going to have a great idea about what you ought to do differently. and I think you need to equip yourself career-wise to become better. The last thing I leave students with is my belief, and I'm biased, promotion criteria in the next 10 to 15 years are going to include your ability to manage change. The leader that shows him or herself able to move with these punches and be savvy about how to do it is going to be worth their weight in gold. Okay, we're in a couple of minutes over. Thank you. I'm going to stop, open it up, anything you've got. We have about 15 minutes to go at it. Can you shout? Go ahead.
I understand your concept about major strategic change in business, but how does that relate to mid-level, lower-level managers trying to get change done on a day-to-day basis? Because
Good.
The way that this would work, nothing will get done. It takes long.
Right. I agree with your first part of your question. I don't know I agree with the second. Let me tell you why. Again, if I had more time, I would deal with it, but we talk about cascading change. If you take the strategic change and you're at the mid-level of the organization, you ought to be able to say, if they do that, what's the implication going to be for my department? And then go through the exact same sequence. How much time you devote to it? Heck, I don't care if you devote 30 minutes to it. But go through the sequence saying, my boss is going to be asking me to consolidate these two departments and make them one. What are my skills as a leader? Can I pull it off? Do I have a trusted colleague who's a little smoother than I am? Has, people more willing to eat out of the palm of his hands, whatever. Who am I asking to follow this change? Hey, these are people that have been through 8,000 changes in the last 2 years, and they let it roll off their backs just like a duck with water. Not a problem. Or, gee, these are people that have been really stodgy. They've come from 2 different organizations. This one was entrepreneurial. This one was bureaucratic. Ooh, I'm going to have a heck of a time blending those two. I think you can go through each one of these questions, and you may not have the degrees of freedom that the executive have. You can't go in there and say, well, I ain't doing it. I understand that. But I think you will at least have alerted yourself to where do I need to pay really close attention. What do I really need to do to smooth the way for this change? Okay? Let's take the 2 departments, one entrepreneurial and one bureaucratic. First thing that pops up, go slow. Spend time with both. Try to cross-fertilize, transfer some people from here to here and from here to here. Break down some of that natural tension in preparation for when you know you're going to have to make the move. Okay? So I think it's a matter of degree if you're a middle manager or even a lower level manager, but everybody up and down that line is a change leader. And everybody up and down that line has a responsibility to do it the best way they can. Does that help at all?
So suppose you kind of come in at mid-change and you see that you're in the change process but it's not working out. How do you apply that model? How do you address that situation?
That's a good question. There are career-limiting moves that you could pull, but I think interjecting yourself in the middle of a change really depends on your personal credibility as to whether you can pull it off. Sometimes the best you can do is keep a low profile, give your advice to whoever you think you can give it to, but don't try to block it because, again, unless you have the charisma the personal credibility, the reputation from another job, why would people follow you? I mean, that's a question I want all of you to ask yourselves. Why should anybody follow me? And if the answer is it's not clear why anybody would, you may be 100% right about that change, but you are powerless to change it. Which, by the way, with all the things I said about HR people and so on, that's one of the reasons you want to fight to try to get at the table as early as possible, because you want to influence your leadership when they're still influenceable. One of the worst sayings in business is we can't roll it out till we dot the I's and cross the T's. That is nonsense, because by the time most of us, you and I, have dotted the I's and crossed the T's, we're entrenched. We ain't changing. We're committed. When I want to get to executives is before they dotted the I's and crossed the T's and try to influence them. So sometimes that's all you have. Okay?
Do you think that sunk cost, I mean, you were just pointing on that. Do you think sunk cost happens a lot in those kind of change decisions? Like, I've gone so far, I might as well continue with that, that change.
Oh, sure. And the accountants developed the term sunk cost for a reason. And one of the things we supposedly try to teach our accounting students, I don't know, do we, Terry, about sunk cost? Is that at some point we need to decide that it's not worth it. And you know, political scientists have studied sunk costs in terms of commitments we make to strategic changes in a foreign relations or war situation. A lot. I see it more than I don't. Because it's very hard to say, yeah, I joke with people, I do a lot of work with IT people, and I always ask them about ERPs, okay, enterprise resource systems. And every time I use the term ERP, I get chuckles in the audience. I say, okay, how many of you have done it? All of them. How many did it cost almost twice as much as you projected? Everybody. How many did it take twice as long? Everybody. How many did it have more trouble than you thought it would have? Everybody. So you know what? These data are out on the street. Next time you're in a golf course, ask your buddy, hey, how did it go? And that person is going to tell you, oh my God, don't believe the consultants. It costs twice as much, takes twice as long, and works half as well. If you knew that, maybe you wouldn't do it. Why does every executive think that they're different? Why does oh no, we're good, we're going to do it. And yet they fall into the same trap. And once they're in that trap, they keep sinking money into it. Why? Because it would be an embarrassment to say, well, you know, I screwed up. So yeah, I think sunk cost is a very important human motivation. Up there where it says personal interpretation, you'll notice one of the things I pushed for is bouncing your ideas off other people. The only protection against sunk cost that I know of is open up your thinking and collaborate with other like-minded people and say, what's going on here? And let them tell you. And if they're of the feeling that we ought to cut our losses and get out of this, maybe you should. When we're encapsulated, insulated, we tend not to do that. Okay?
I'd like to ask you to use this model to interpret two situations for me.
Uh-oh. Knowing where you come from, I'm not sure I want to do that.
One has to do with the situation that you write about in your book, in which, you know, given the findings of the 911 Commission, there's a whole lot of agreement that there needs to be integrated change for a better future, you know, and the other, so I'd like to know, what would you do all these years later to come to this vision that would be a better future given the outcomes of those reports? The other situation is one where it's mostly external change. What would you say if you were the chancellor of the university system or one of the presidents of the system, faced with the kinds of budget cuts that we're facing that are making us adapt to not a better future? How would how would this model relate to both of those situations, unrealized better future and adjusting to the situation of the current financial exigencies?
And how many hours do we have?
Well, we have a very nice reception with food outside, so...
Well, I have an incentive to cut it short. Now, let's tackle them in sequence. The first one, and Terry, especially you because you've worked with sustainability and other types of issues, notice how long it takes to get traction, okay? And nothing about change leadership says that it has to always be for the betterment of society. That's a separate value-laden, assessment. But if you want something to happen good in government, such as coordinating agencies to be better prepared for dealing with emergencies, somebody has to raise consciousness like they do with greening of America and with sustainability, that this is a worthwhile thing to do. Unfortunately, none of our senior leadership in Washington has ever had that inkling that, gee, if we did this better, it might help the country. So what do? Back of the napkin, reorganize FEMA, get a hack, put him at the head. It's good enough. Hey, Brownie, you're doing a great job. Let's do it. So I think it's a consciousness raising that I'm trying to do at the executive level that we need to do at the government level. Why don't we have more change-savvy people? And we have two candidates, each trying to take the change mantle. And the question I would ask, what does either one know about really introducing change into Washington? They all want to do it, and I don't question their motives. But do they have the wherewithal? Do they have the tools? Where on their staff is an individual who worries about these issues? Where have they gotten their background and education on these issues? So I think if we're going to improve our society, we need people who are not only saying they're going to change institutions, but people who need to have the skill set to change those institutions. And that I don't see out there, okay? The second question with budgets and university, part of that is, in fact, the process. I lived in this system for 34 years, okay? One of my best performance reviews occurred in the year during the Jimmy Carter administration when we had 0% raises. And I walked out of that review as pumped up as I have from any other review, including those that gave me 2% raises. And the point being that the budget didn't have anything to do with the goals of the organization. If the leader convinced me that he or she really is trying to make this place better, I'm smart enough to cut him slack and say, I read in the paper that the governor cut your budget 7%. I don't expect you to do wonders. But if I'm on Wall Street and the leader gets $22 billion for screwing up, and you're asking me to suck it up because times are bad, you're going to get resistance. Who's expected to follow? A bunch of disgruntled people who feel they've been shafted. So I'm not that worried about the state budget and making change in the university. I think a lot of the stuff is out on the table that kind of takes care of the embracing of the change. Now, we can argue on the margin whether my travel budget is more important than your Xerox budget, whatever. Not that big an issue, I don't think. Does that make sense? So, again, and I've been through the state budget up and down, and frankly, that was never been an issue. During some of our best times, and I don't have to remind you that, 1989, 1990, we went through hell on this campus due to changes that were poorly thought out, that did not take into account who had to implement them, did not really fit the reality of the educational workplace, and the College of Management wound up being lumped in with liberal arts. Talk about an idea that just was not a good idea. Had nothing to do with budget. Okay?
Any more questions? Thanks for coming out today, David. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.